In this demo, we will have a look at the potential status codes that are returned from our actions. We will focus on the actions to get data. Later on, in the next module, we will also have a look at what happens when we create, update, or delete data. So, REST lives on the outer-facing layer. Whatever happens beneath that isn't of importance. So, all these status codes should also be seen as reflecting the current status of the resource at the outer-facing layer, the API contract. We've learned that not found signifies that the resource at the requested URI cannot be found. And we're looking at the getAuthors action here, which returns a collection of authors. There's no return not found to be seen here, even though you could end up with an empty collection, right? Yet this is correct. An empty collection does not mean that the author's resource couldn't be found. It means that the author's resource was found. It just happens to be an empty collection. So, from the point of view of the outer-facing layer, a not found is not possible here. Then let's have a look at the getAuthor action. In this case, we do need to return a not found if the author isn't found. That means that the author ID that gets passed through reflects a resource that doesn't exist, which means that the resource at the URI you're trying to get doesn't exist. We need a check for this. And there's already a check in here. We fetch the author from the repository, and if it's null, we return a not found. But there's another approach we can take as well. On the course library repository, there's also an author exists async method that will execute an additional database call. After that, we could then get the author and return it. So, why not use that method? Well, it means an additional call into the database. And also, it's not completely error-prone. We would first be checking whether the author exists, and afterwards we're getting that author. In case of high-volume traffic, that split second might be enough for a failed call to get the author if it was deleted by another consumer of the API in that split second. Now, there are situations when you can't avoid things like this. But if we can, we should. So, in this case, getting the author and doing a null check carries my preference. If it is null, we return a not found. As a general rule, what I like to do for these not found checks is get the author and do a null check if we need the entity afterwards, for example, for mapping. That is the case here. But if we don't need to use the entity afterwards, I tend to use an exist check, like author exists. Checks like these may mean that you have to write additional code, and even have to do additional round trips to an underlying database. We can try to minimize that as we just did, but sometimes we won't be able to. But even then, these checks are necessary when building a RESTful API to be able to correctly return the status codes, as we just learned. By the way, these methods like OK and not found and so on are defined on controller base. And that is why we have easy access to them. Our controller derives from controller base. And if we have a look, we can see much more methods we can use defined on it that nicely map to the status codes we've seen on the slides. Alright, we had two more get actions. One to get the courses of a specific author and one to get one specific course. Those are defined in the courses controller, so let's switch to that. We're looking at get courses for author. Here, I do execute that author exists async check. We cannot get courses from an unexisting author. A request to such a URI means that the resource cannot be found, so that warrants a not found status codes as a result. Now, we could also have fetched the author, just like we did on the authors controller, by calling into getAuthorAsync. But here I specifically chose not to do that because we don't have a need for the author entity afterwards anymore. If the author exists, we can continue by getting all the courses for that author, mapping them and returning them. Let's scroll down a bit. You're looking at the action to get one specific course for an author. And here you can see the two different approaches combined. First, we check whether the author exists by calling in the author exists async method on the repository. We have no need for the author anymore, so this is the advised approach. We return a not found if the author cannot be found. Afterwards, we call into the repository to get one specific course related to that author. We don't use a course exists async method here, but we get the actual course entity as we need it afterwards to map to a course DTO. If no course can be found, we also return a not found. Alright, let's give this a try. We're back in Postman. Let's try getting an author that does not exist. This should result in a 404 not found. And that is indeed the case. Another request I've got lined up here is getting the courses for an author that doesn't exist. This too results in a 404 not found, as it should. And then we had two more checks that could result in a 404 not found, which is getting one course for an author that doesn't exist. And it indeed results in a 404 not found. And getting a course for an author that does exist, but of which the course ID doesn't exist, also returns 404 not found. So all our checks work out. An interesting fact here is that what you see in the response body isn't just a random piece of JSON. It's an implementation of the problem details for HTTP APIs RFC. This specification was created to allow to define common error formats for those applications that need one, so they aren't required to define their own. The reasoning behind this is that sometimes HTTP status codes alone are not sufficient to convey enough information about an error to be helpful. In our example, it kinda is. 404 is the status code, and the rest of the response body doesn't really include additional information on that 404 not found. Except maybe a trace ID that can be useful for debugging or finding the issue. We will encounter this problem detail standard again later on in the course when we deal with validation. And that is where this will become very useful. And while we're on the subject of mistakes, let's learn a bit more about them. Because when talking about RESTful APIs, there's a difference between errors and faults.